Like most people, I spent most of my childhood addicted to Pokemon. And you might think as an adult it's gotten better, but it really has only gotten worse. There is just something about getting to roleplay as Michael Vick with superpowered animals that I cannot get enough of. And it all started on the Game Boy. The first Pokemon games ever released were Pokemon Red and Green in Japan, but I have no idea how to play that. So over here in the United States, the first games we got were Red and Blue. From what I've gathered, the reason was to appeal to Americans by having the colors resemble that of the American flag, along with the red and blue case having a better contrast. And in the long run, I'm not sure if that really would have mattered, because even though it came out towards the end of it, they went on to dominate the Game Boy's lifespan, and when combined with Pokemon Yellow, ended up being the best-selling games on the console by a huge margin. You know a game is popular when it makes Tetris look like the underdog, and kids all over the world went absolutely feral for this game. Anytime a 9-year-old touched a copy of Pokemon Red, they immediately became an addict.
Give me that. You need to go play outside like a normal child. No, please, give it back. I just need my fix. Bad. Bad, go outside!
The game starts with Professor Oak introducing you to the world of Pokemon. You get to pick your name and your rival's name, something they stopped doing in Pokemon for a couple of reasons. And then you finally begin your adventure. Professor Oak stops you from wandering into the tall grass and gives you one of 3 Pokemon to select. The legendary first starters were Charmander, Bulbasaur, and Squirtle, and whoever you picked here for the first time determined exactly who you were gonna be as a person.
After a lot of thinking, I'm gonna take Squirtle. It was nice knowing you, but you're dead to me now.
And immediately after making the hardest choice of your life, your rival picks whatever Pokemon will counter you, and you have your first battle. It essentially serves as the tutorial of the game, explaining how Pokemon battles are a fancy version of rock, paper, scissors. And whether you win or lose, you then have to go play Postman for Professor Oak, and then and only then can you begin your journey. Suffering through the beginning of Red and Blue has become a rite of passage, and whoever you ended up picking as your starter Pokemon will affect the game far more than any other Pokemon title. If you pick Squirtle, the game will be easy. If you pick Bulbasaur, the game will be easy. But if you pick Charmander,
please just put me out of my misery.
The first gym is led by Brock, who uses a collection of rock-type Pokemon. So for people who pick Charmander, you're going to get absolutely bullied unless you grind for an egregious amount of time. There are Pokemon you can catch, but most of them are not going to be helpful at all. There's Pidgey, Spearow, the Nidorans, Rattata, Weedle, Caterpie, and Pikachu. Both of the birds are normal and flying type, which immediately makes them useless. Rattata is only a normal type, also being useless. The Nidorans won't be helpful unless you level them up to level 50, and by the time you get there, they'll already be strong enough to beat the gym. Pikachu is pretty rare and also not going to be helpful. Weedle is bug and poison and also not going to be helpful, which only leaves Caterpie, which you could evolve into a Butterfree to help, or you can do what I did and just grind your Charmander until it evolves and then just fight the gym until you win. But once you get past that first gym, the game starts to open up a lot more, giving you a much larger selection of Pokemon to choose from. The original 151 Pokemon are iconic for a reason. The designs appeal to everyone. You had Nidoking and Nidoqueen, which look like monsters, Clefairy, which is just adorable, and of course the best Pokemon ever made, Bellsprout, who is the best designed Pokemon of all time.
My bias is showing.
Red and Blue came out long before the internet was what it is today, and most people would get their information about Pokemon by talking with friends. Because one of the main reasons Pokemon took the world by storm was because it was designed to be a social game. Going to school and talking to friends about what Pokemon you caught, how many gym badges you've collected, and everything else you've learned about the game was a part of the experience. The point of having split releases was to encourage you and your friends to get different versions of the game to trade and battle together. I remember playing through Pokemon Blue and having my brother show me Pokemon that he caught in Red, and even after putting countless hours into the game, I was still shocked there were Pokemon I had not seen.
Did you say it has scythes for hands? Here, take my Rolex.
Part of the reason Pokemon did so well is that it made use of the Game Boy's hardware like no other game. The Game Boy was a handheld gaming console, which meant it was far more portable than any other home console could ever be. so people could bring their consoles wherever they went. And Pokemon was the first game to truly capitalize on this idea in a big way. Using a link cable to connect and trade with friends was a brilliant idea, which only enhanced what made Pokemon incredible already. The adventure that Red and Blue take you on was something that was never really done in a game prior to this. Having 150 different Pokemon to use made it so you could have a composition of any Pokemon you wanted on your team, which meant you and your friend could have a completely different experience playing the game, even if the core of the game was the same for everybody. Though it's not my favorite, Kanto is a solid region. It was the first Pokemon region, so there are gonna be some faults. Like I said before, progressing through the early game is not great. After Mount Moon, you can't backtrack at all until you get to Vermilion City, which in my opinion is just bad game design. Not having the ability to run is something that I think the earliest games really suffer with. And I know that you can get around with the bike using dig or teleport, but having to walk everywhere, especially in the early game, is incredibly slow. But beyond that, the rest of the region is pretty incredible. It has the best safari zone in all of Pokemon, some of the most iconic cities, and Bill's house for people who want to get violated. I do not trust this man. The original Pokemon games are really fun, even if they are really broken. There are ways to exploit this game to do pretty much anything you want. If you want to catch Pokemon that don't exist, go for it. If you want to get Mew who is not accessible in any other way, you can do that. Or if you want to go into the first gym with a level 100 Nidoking, it's entirely possible. Now, it's not the intended way to play, but there's something so satisfying about how broken and janky this game is that makes it really satisfying. And the only major problem I have with this game is how broken two of the types are. The Dragon and Psychic types are entirely busted. Dragon is the lesser of the two because it only affects Dragonite's line, and there weren't that many Dragon type moves that make them extremely overpowered. But unless you had one of the few Ice or Dragon type Pokemon, they were just a pain to get through. But that is nothing compared to how busted Psychic types were. Their only weakness in this generation was Bug, and Bug types, especially in this game, were not that great. Scyther and Pinsir are the only exceptions to being actually good Bug types, but they don't learn any Bug type moves.
Oh, I get it. This is stupid.
So at that point, you only have a few options and none of them are good, which lets Psychic just steamroll pretty much every other type. But how broken this game is part of the charm. The more recent Pokemon games have ironed out the formula a lot, but going back to the earliest games in the series is a great trip down memory lane. Though they have their issues and they're not my favorite Pokemon game, I can't sit here and say they're bad by any means. And with Pokemon being a cultural sensation at this point, just over a year later, they released Pokémon Yellow Special Pikachu Edition. Pokemon wasn't just popular because of the games, the TV show and trading cards were doing numbers as well. And a countless number of kids across the world wanted to live their dream and be Ash Ketchum. So the Pokemon Company decided to make as much money as they possibly could and create Pokémon Yellow, reshaping their first games to feel more like Ash's journey in the show, which looking back was a brilliant decision by the Pokemon Company, changing just enough about a game to make people want to buy another version because it has options that weren't available in the originals, and giving them a chance to fix issues in their current games. The third version became Pokemon's go-to move going forward, generally offering a better experience than the standard games. And Pokémon Yellow was exactly that. The biggest and most notable change is that in this version you start with a Pikachu instead of the other three starters. And even better, all three are still obtainable in the game.
Oh yeah, that is nice right there.
The Pikachu that you have follows you around for the entire game, and they reworked its moveset to be much more usable for the long term. It is sort of annoying that you can't evolve it into a Raichu, and because he's your starter, they removed Pikachu from the Pokemon pool, making it so you just cannot get Raichu in this game without trading. But if you're playing this game to live out your Ash Ketchum fantasies like I was, that really wasn't a big problem. One of my favorite changes is that they made the early game so much more bearable. Pikachu falls into the exact same category that Charmander did, where he is borderline useless during the first gym, but at least this time they made the Nidorans learn Double Kick at a somewhat reasonable level, which made it so there is an actual option to fight Brock, which is really nice. Brock's Pokemon also got some changes, making him much easier to fight, which fixes a lot of my issues with the early game. Not being able to backtrack is still a bit of an issue, but by the time you get to the second gym, you're able to get a Bulbasaur and a Charmander pretty easily, which makes it so I don't really have to go back. Compared to a lot of other third versions, this has some of my favorite changes. Being able to get all 3 starter Pokemon in the game is extremely convenient, and is something that I miss in all of the other third version games. And getting to see characters like Jesse and James from the anime make their debut in a Pokemon game was incredibly cool the first time I played the game. The balance issues still exist, but it makes it much more digestible when the game itself got so many positive changes. Red and Blue are incredible in their own right and much better if you're someone who likes to speedrun, but if you're someone like me who wants the full Pokemon experience, Pokemon Yellow is just a better fit. If you were one of the 3 people who at the time wasn't playing Pokemon and you didn't know where to start, this was the perfect game to do that. And overall, Red, Blue, and Yellow are incredible games. But in between the release of these 3 games, there was another Pokemon game that launched, and that was Pokémon Pinball. I think Nintendo's favorite thing to do is to take one of their IPs and turn it into pinball, and at this time, it was a really good idea. The major appeal of the Game Boy is that it was portable, and I would much rather carry around this than a full-size pinball table. They already made a good working pinball game starring Kirby, so why not capitalize on Pokemon's incredible success by making Pokémon Pinball? But there is far more to this game than just playing pinball. All 151 Pokemon from Red and Blue are available in this game. Though it's a little annoying having to deal with RNG to catch everything, the overall idea of using Pokeballs as pinballs works incredibly well. While playing, you upgrade your Pokeball into a Great Ball, then an Ultra Ball, and eventually a Master Ball, which helps you score even more points. There are 2 boards available, a red board and a blue board.
That's a pretty big brain move there, Nintendo.
Each board has a different selection of Pokemon to catch, which splits up the gameplay enough where it's interesting even if the red board is the superior option. They have a Bellsprout built into the board that's going to be the best no matter what. The point of Pokemon Pinball was to be an easy game for anyone to pick up and play. The main series Pokemon games don't appeal to everyone, and even though in the modern day pinball has kind of been forgotten, back in the late 90s it was more prevalent than now. So to have an infinitely replayable Pokemon themed pinball machine in your pocket at all times was something that attracted a lot of people. I am not even a big pinball fan, but this and its sequel are both incredible to me, and I'm willing to admit it could be nostalgia, but just by looking at this you can tell it's going to be a fun time. But if you were more interested in the Pokemon Trading Card Game, then they had a video game for you. Pokémon Trading Card Game.
Wow, what a creative name.
I, like most people, collected Pokemon cards but never used them to actually play the game. I mostly just opened the packs because I was cripplingly addicted to it. So as a kid, I completely ignored the fact this game existed, but one day on a trip to the game store, I saw a copy of this and picked it up on a whim and became cripplingly addicted to this. This is one of my favorite Pokemon spin-offs of all time, and it's a shame the sequel was only released in Japan because I need more. You play this just the same way you'd play the original Pokemon card game. It has gotten a lot more complicated over the years, but it still retains the same basic structure that it did at the time. If you are not a fan of card games, then there is a solid chance you will not enjoy this, because the entire point of this game is just playing the Pokemon card game. But instead of having to find people to play against, you get a bunch of computers who you can replay infinitely. Whenever you win, you're given Pokemon card packs, which you can open to get more cards to improve your deck. And though you're not physically opening the card packs, it is still really addicting to beat someone and wonder what cards you're going to get. I have spent a ludicrous amount of time playing this on the Game Boy and on the Virtual Console, and whenever I end up picking this up again, I always get cripplingly addicted for about a week. The biggest problem with this is that the early game is really painful to get through, which seems to have been a trend in most early Pokemon games. At the start, you're given the choice between one of 3 decks based off of Charmander, Squirtle, and Bulbasaur, of course, and these decks are extremely bad. So the first bunch of matches you play are going to come down to pure RNG and coin flips. But once you get more cards and you can build actual decks, the game is really fun. Nowadays, there are a bunch of ways to play the Pokemon Trading Card Game online, but it's really nice to have an old game to go back to see how the game used to be played. Whether you play this on the Game Boy Color, the 3DS's Virtual Console, or the Switch, you are going to have a great time, and I highly recommend checking it out if you're into card games. And if you're not, then you can go play pinball and still have a good time. But if you were like most people, you were waiting for a sequel to the main series games. And when Pokemon Gold and Silver finally released, they took the world by storm yet again. Pokemon Gold and Silver is where the series really found its footing, and they added a lot of things that became staples for the rest of the series going forward. Just from the cover art alone, you knew you were getting something special. In Pokémon Red and Blue, you had Charizard and Blastoise on the cover, which are final evolutions of starter Pokémon that are accessible no matter what version you play. But Gold and Silver had Ho-Oh and Lugia right on the cover, which highlighted how different these versions were going to be. Mewtwo is one of my favorite legendaries of all time, but it was just him regardless if you were playing Red, Blue, or Yellow. But having box art legendaries that differ by what version you play has been something that has been a standard for Pokemon since these games. Gold and Silver are a direct sequel to Red and Blue. They take place 3 years after the events of those games, and show the direct impact of what happened with Team Rocket. It is a double-edged sword though, because it is great to have a sequel to a Pokemon game, but in this case it really limited the amount of storytelling they were able to do. Team Rocket doesn't play as big of a role as it did in Red and Blue, though they're still the main villain organization of the game. But for what it lacks in story revolving around Team Rocket, it makes up for it by having a much more engaging region. Johto's charm is about the story of the region. Ecruteak City has the burned tower that gave birth to Suicune, Entei, and Raikou. Ho-Oh and Lugia both spawn in their own locations, and both Ho-Oh and Lugia have their own stories and lore behind them which make them both interesting. And though the region is physically connected to Kanto, it feels like an entirely new place. The entire region feels like it takes place 10 years in the past compared to Kanto. And whether you're going to get medicine for the Ampharos in the lighthouse, or talking to NPCs about the lore of the area, or exploring the ancient ruins of Alph, which admittedly are just kind of there, Johto has a feeling that is not really replicated in other Pokemon games. And maybe I'm biased because they have a whole tower dedicated to my favorite Pokemon, but I've always felt that Johto was an incredible region. And my only problem with it is that they could have done so much more. When you start the game in Gold and Silver, you get to meet a new professor and start a new journey. There's 3 new starter Pokemon, being Chikorita, Totodile, and Cyndaquil, which I don't like as much as the Gen 1 starters, but they're definitely not bad. And you're given the task of going to pick up an egg from Professor Oak.
Hey, I know that guy!
Buy my cryptocurrency token. Once you return, you realize Professor Elm's lab has been robbed by someone who is lurking outside. On the way back, you get to battle him and then find out his name, which you get to decide, and I understand why they don't let us do this anymore, but again, I really want that to come back. And after you go snitch to the cops about what happened, you get to fully begin your journey. In my opinion, Gold and Silver have a much better early game compared to Red and Blue. The first gym is a flying type gym leader, so only one Pokemon is weak to that, but if you're picking Chikorita anyways, that's a problem. Speaking of gym leaders, one thing I've never truly loved about Generation 2 is the collection of gyms that are available. Not the gym leaders themselves, who are all well designed, but mostly the Pokemon on their teams. This was the second generation and they added a bunch of new Pokemon, but most of the gym leaders end up using Gen 1 Pokemon anyways. Granted, there wasn't the largest selection of new Pokemon in Gen 2, mostly because this was supposed to be the last Pokemon game they made, but in hindsight they should have added more Pokemon and had those Pokemon used in gyms. 4 out of the 8 Pokemon gym leaders in this game only use Pokemon from Kanto, and with this being a new generation, I just wish they added more variety here. And a lot of the new Pokemon they added don't have the best designs. Remoraid for some reason evolves into Octillery, which is something I've never understood. Snubble's evolutionary line gives me heartburn, and I've never understood the purpose of Unknown. Granted, Gen 2 also had some absolutely incredible designs, like Wooper's line, Heracross, which is one of my favorite Pokemon, and Shuckle, who looks like a good time, but out of the 100 new Pokemon, a lot of them were just evolutions or pre-evolutions of existing Pokemon. And again, I understand at the time this was supposed to be the last Pokemon game, but to me that's not an excuse to be lazy with designs. But putting aside some of the Pokemon related issues, gameplay wise they improved a lot about the game. The introduction of the new Dark and Steel types really helped add balance to what was there, making it so when I now see an Alakazam I no longer have Night Terrors.
Oh god!
Playing Gold and Silver is like a night and day difference compared to the first games. Beating through the first 8 gyms and the Elite Four is extremely rewarding and fun. The rival in the game is one of the best in the entire series, being a character that most people genuinely dislike and want to beat while playing the game. And once it's over, over, you still have the entirety of Kanto to go back to. When you compare Kanto in Gold and Silver to Red and Blue, it's gonna be a little bit more starved for content, but I can honestly get over that because there are 8 more gyms to explore and the entirety of the first region. While you play through the Johto section of Gold and Silver, you get to hear about and see a lot of things that have changed over in Kanto. Koga is now part of the Elite Four, meaning someone took his place in Kanto. But you get to find that out for yourself by going and checking. They removed a lot of things in order to get Kanto to fit inside the game, and even though it's not as flushed out and engaging as it was in the originals, being able to go back and see what changed is incredible. Getting to see the changes in the character designs and the gym system is really rewarding to people who had played the original game, but you didn't have to beat through Red and Blue in order to enjoy it. But once you beat through all of Kanto and the Elite Four for the second time, there is one of the best fights in Pokemon history against Red. Getting to fight the character that you played as in the last game is one of the coolest things they have ever added to Pokemon. Red has become one of the most legendary characters in Pokemon history, and getting to fight him and his team on the top of Mount Silver is one of the most climactic events in the entirety of the Pokemon series, and it's not even close. Gold and Silver did so much to differentiate itself from Red and Blue that even though the Johto and Kanto region are connected, they feel like 2 entirely different locations. And though there were some issues because the Pokemon Company didn't plan as well as they should have, Gold and Silver are still 2 incredible games. And after the success of these, it was only natural for Pokemon to make another game, Pokémon Puzzle Challenge.
What in Tyranitar Nation?
Just a short while after Pokemon Gold and Silver, we got Puzzle Challenge. This is a game that has always confused me, because this is a sequel to a game that released in the same year. Pokemon Puzzle League was released for the N64, and this was the mobile game alternative, except the N64 version focused on Kanto Pokemon, where this focused on the new Johto Pokemon. The gameplay is very simple. You move blocks around in order to get a row of at least 3, and as soon as you have 3 in a row, the blocks disappear, giving you points with the goal of not having the blocks reach the top. Blocks will slowly rise up from the bottom, and your goal is to keep matching in order to not lose. There are a few different game modes like Marathon, Challenge, Time Zone, Line Clear, and Puzzle, but of course there was the best game mode, aptly titled Garbage, which I think is just a hilarious name for a game mode. Most of the game modes are fine, but what really stands out is the Challenge mode, which brings you through a simple little story mode where you fight through gym leaders. On the right side of the screen, there's a little Pokemon that you have to defeat by matching blocks together, which in my opinion is a pretty good way to do a single player. I'll be honest, this isn't my favorite Pokemon spin-off game, mostly because I prefer many of the other Pokemon puzzle games we've gotten, but as far as puzzle games go, there is nothing bad about this. One of my favorite parts about this is that the music is a remixed version of the Gen 2 soundtrack to make it sound more like a puzzle game. It's a simple little detail, but I really like it. If you're a fan of puzzle games or get bored for 45 minutes, this is a perfect game to check out, but I wouldn't expect it to be as groundbreaking as the next game, Pokémon Crystal. Similar to how Pokémon Yellow was to Red and Blue, Pokémon Crystal serves as the third version of Gold and Silver. And this is the best way to play this generation, hands down. Crystal didn't fix as many issues as Yellow did, but it made up for that by adding a lot of content that wasn't available in Gold and Silver, which just enhances the experience. Pokémon Yellow was much more focused on being an anime equivalent, where Pokémon Crystal was more focused on being an enhanced version. Before you even start playing the game, the first and most noticeable change is that you can now play as a female character for the first time. This is purely for aesthetic, but having the option is nice, and I'm glad this has become the standard for the rest of the Pokemon series down the line. The story remains relatively the same, except this time there is a much larger focus on Suicune. There's a new character, Eugene, but it's spelled Eugene.
Alright, that's cool. My name's SHMidas, and I spell it like this.
I don't know how they ended up on this spelling, but I can also barely read, so my opinion is pretty much invalid. The added focus on Suicune was a nice touch because it added more to the story and lore of the Johto region, which was my favorite part about Gold and Silver to begin with. There were aesthetic changes to locations around the map, mainly the burned tower, which now actually looks burned. There were new trainer battles throughout the game, which was much nicer. The issue still existed with the gym leaders not having the best selection of Pokemon, which is still something that bothers me to this day. But one thing they added to this game, which is one of my favorite changes in all of Pokemon, was the ability to have Pokemon have animated sprites. When a trainer throws their Pokemon into battle, it'll do a little dancey dance, which is a very subtle detail, but it was just enough to make the battles feel more organic. A lot of people say it's not worth it to play Gold and Silver if Crystal exists, but there are two big reasons why I think that's not the case. When you play through Gold and Silver and then go to play Crystal, it's far easier to appreciate all of the quality of life changes that were added to the game, where if you just play Pokemon Crystal, it's nowhere near as noticeable. And the second and arguably most important is that if you want to have Mareep on your team to get an Ampharos, you can't do that in Pokemon Crystal, which in my opinion is a crime on par with parking in front of a hydrant. Whoever's decision it was to not include the Mareep line, I'm coming for you. It's always worth it to play the third versions of any given region, because they will add a lot of things that make it the premier way to play, and barring not being able to have an Ampharos on your team, I think that Crystal is an incredible time. But the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color era of Pokemon was absolutely incredible. It started what has gone on to be the best-selling media franchise of all time. It has even gone on to beat out Star Wars, which is something that not a lot of things can say. But what do you think the best Pokemon game on the Game Boy is? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching. I hope that you and your family have an incredible rest of your day, and if you like anything that you saw here, please consider subscribing.